A Nation with Two Faces. Brave Nation, but in the Darkness. Author, Dr. Azami. Overview. The book A Nation with Two Faces covers many important topics related to the September 11 attacks and their implications for Afghanistan. It provides an overview of the early successes and missteps in stabilizing the region, detailing the US-led invasion, its objectives, initial strategies, and the immediate impact on Afghanistan's political landscape. The book also explores the historical context of the Taliban's emergence in the 1990s, analyzing their rule before 2001 and their resurgence following the US invasion. It discusses civilian casualties and the impact on Afghan families, incorporating personal stories from civilians. Additionally, it examines changes in women's rights and roles after 2001 and how media coverage shaped public perception of the war. Furthermore, the book analyzes the decision to withdraw troops, its execution, and the reactions from various stakeholders, including the Afghan government, the Taliban, and local populations. It highlights the ongoing struggle for basic human rights and services in Afghanistan.
In the following pages, we embark on a profound exploration of Afghanistan's tumultuous history over the past 4 decades, a narrative marked by conflict, resilience, and the indomitable spirit of its people. This account is not merely a recounting of events but a deeply personal reflection from those who lived through the harrowing experiences of war and occupation. The text is anchored in the eyewitness accounts of individuals who witnessed the US and NATO invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. A pivotal moment that forever altered the course of the nation. As we delve into their stories, we confront the stark realities of war, the loss of lives, the devastation of communities, and the psychological scars that linger long after the bombs have fallen. These narratives serve as a testament to the profound impact decades of conflict have had on every facet of Afghan life. We begin with an examination of Afghanistan's rich history, a land steeped in cultural achievements and historical significance, before transitioning to the more recent past. The author reflects on their own experiences as a young witness to the invasion, capturing the chaos and fear that enveloped their village during those early days of bombardment. Through vivid descriptions and poignant memories, we gain insight into the human cost of war, as families are torn apart and communities are left in ruins. The text also raises critical questions about the motivations behind foreign intervention in Afghanistan. What were the true objectives of the US and its allies? Was it genuinely about combating terrorism, or were there deeper geopolitical interests at play? These inquiries challenge prevailing narratives and invite readers to reconsider their understanding of this complex conflict. Moreover, this work does not shy away from addressing uncomfortable truths. It highlights instances of war crimes and human rights violations committed during the invasion, prompting us to reflect on our collective responsibility toward those affected by such actions. The voices presented here are not merely historical, they resonate with urgency as they call for accountability and justice. As you engage with these texts, I encourage you to approach them with an open mind and heart. The stories shared within these pages are not just accounts of suffering. They are also tales of resilience, hope, and a longing for peace. They remind us that behind every statistic lies a human story, one that deserves to be heard and understood. In sharing these experiences, we honor those who have endured unimaginable hardships while also seeking to illuminate a path toward healing and reconciliation for Afghanistan and its people.
Introduction. Afghanistan in the Eye of History. My witness and an eyewitness's account of America and its allies' invasion, occupation, of Afghanistan. The last 43 years have marked the beginning of a harrowing era characterized by deconstruction, devastation, and darkness for a nation that boasts a history spanning 5,000 years. This prolonged period of conflict has inflicted immense damage on the country and its people, impacting every facet of Afghan life. The consequences of these decades of strife are staggering: more than 2 million lives lost, over 3 million injured or disabled, and up to 6 million forced into exile. Moreover, nearly the entire infrastructure of the country lies in ruins. In light of this history, I pose several critical questions that, while simple in form, carry profound significance for the reader of this book. 1. What are the root causes of this conflict, and how did it initially arise? 2. What factors contribute to the ongoing nature of this conflict and the lack of resolution? 3. Who are the key players perpetuating the conflict, and what interests do they serve? Afghanistan is not a nation born of chance or a mere agreement, it is a land steeped in a rich history of empires and cultural achievements. Historically, Afghans were celebrated for their bravery, intelligence, hospitality, and their roles as peacemakers. The question now arises, what led to this decline into darkness, and who bears the responsibility for it? Prior to 1979, Afghanistan was a thriving nation with robust international relationships and significant influence on global affairs. As a 34-year-old, I want to focus on the past 20 years, 2001 to 2021, concerning issues such as security, instability, poverty, economic conditions, freedom, education, access to basic human rights, including clean water and healthcare, governance, and the roles of the international community. This includes the contributions and responsibilities of neighboring countries and the involvement of foreign troops, particularly those from the United States and NATO. I vividly recall the moment when US and NATO forces invaded Afghanistan. I was only 11 years old, during the autumn rice harvesting season. I distinctly remember watching from my home in Kochener, a village in central Baghlan district in Baghlan province in northern Afghanistan. American and NATO forces launched attacks against the Taliban government forces, civilians, and some crucial infrastructure. Our village, not far from Kunduz province, a strategic base for the Taliban, was a focal point of the conflict.
In late 2001, American and NATO air forces bombarded Taliban positions, filling the air with the sound of jets. Many locals were engaged in their fields, preparing for the winter harvest, unaware of the chaos that would soon envelop them. I sat beside a pile of harvested rice, observing the farmers at work when I suddenly heard the roar of US and NATO jets overhead, their ominous silhouettes streaking through the sky. For the first time, I witnessed the sheer number of aircraft, sometimes more than 20 at a time, flying above our village. The B-52 bombers became a constant presence in my life, a terrifying reminder of the war that had begun. The invasion unfolded over several weeks, resulting in the overthrow of the Taliban regime but at a grave cost. Thousands of Afghan civilians lost their lives, tens of thousands were injured, and hundreds of thousands were displaced. While I do not have precise figures on the casualties among Taliban forces, the human toll of this conflict has been incalculable. Throughout the US and NATO invasion of Afghanistan, numerous war crimes were committed by US, NATO, and their Afghan allies. These included bombing hospitals, schools, and civilian homes, attacking funerals and wedding parties, killing innocent children and farmers, and conducting nighttime raids that resulted in family members being killed in front of their loved ones. Women faced harassment and torture, while men were often taken from their homes without explanation. One particularly heinous act involved the killing of thousands of Taliban fighters who surrendered during the invasion. These individuals were not only denied humane treatment but were also placed in containers and dumped into the Amu Darya River. I ask those who advocate for human rights, is this an acceptable violation of those rights? Where is the justification for torturing and executing those who surrendered? I don't want to defend anyone here or take sides with any group. While I do not intend to delve deeply into the actions of Afghan warlords during this period, I will focus primarily on the US and its allies' invasions. Many Afghans continue to grapple with the question, why did the US and its allies invade Afghanistan, and what were their true objectives? The answers often revolve around national interests, historical grievances, and geopolitical strategies. Some speculate that fears regarding Afghanistan's pursuit of freedom and autonomy played a role in the decision to invade. The common narrative in the West claims that the US invaded Afghanistan as a direct response to the September 11th attacks, a claim I challenge. Many believe the war was launched to retaliate against al-Qaeda for the destruction of the World Trade Center. However, this idea is fundamentally flawed.
According to this version of events, after September 11th, U.S. President George W. Bush demanded that the Taliban hand over Osama bin Laden and expel al-Qaeda from Afghanistan. When the Taliban refused, military intervention was deemed necessary. But this explanation raises more questions than it answers. Have you ever questioned who was truly behind the 9/11 attacks? Have you ever wondered why the U.S. government has never fully disclosed the details of its investigation? The idea that al-Qaeda could carry out such a massive attack without significant external support defies logic. Yet many still believe the simplistic narrative that the U.S. and its allies invaded Afghanistan solely to punish al-Qaeda. This version of history is not just misleading, it is dangerously naive. Every Afghan must face a harsh reality: the U.S. and its allies have not been our liberators but our adversaries. Their presence in Afghanistan was never about rebuilding the nation, it was about serving their own interests, even at the cost of our country's destruction. Their actions have fueled chaos, taken countless innocent lives, and strengthened the very forces they claim to be fighting. The unsettling truth is that the U.S. and its allies have been architects of instability in Afghanistan, not its saviors. Many of you may wonder why I have not mentioned the first Taliban regime and the devastation it brought to our country. Their rule caused immense suffering, social, economic, and political. It displaced hundreds of thousands, took the lives of tens of thousands, and crippled essential aspects of Afghan society, including healthcare, welfare, development, education, and the very hope for a better future. I will have not ignored these dark chapters. In my next book, I will explore both the first and second Taliban regimes in depth. I will also examine the role of other involved parties. My approach is independent and unbiased. I have never been, and never will be, part of any political party, group, or movement. In this part of the book, I want to refer to one of the eyewitnesses who experienced the bombing of Kunduz province in 2001 by American forces and their allies' forces.
My name is Omid, and I was 19 years old when the U.S. attack on Afghanistan reached my village near Kunduz in late 2001. Kunduz was a stronghold for the Taliban in northern Afghanistan, and we had known for days that the war was approaching. The days leading up to the U.S. attack were filled with rumors, but nothing could prepare us for what was about to happen. It was October, and the rice harvest was nearly complete. Kunduz was a strategic province for the Taliban, so intense fighting was expected. Every night we could hear gunfire and artillery, but what came next was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I still remember the afternoon when the bombing began. It was a clear day with a vast blue sky, but soon it was filled with the roar of jets, American planes. The noise was deafening, like thunder but longer and more terrifying. I could see bombers flying low, their shadows moving over the fields where my family and neighbors were working. We abandoned everything out of fear of continuing the harvest and ran toward the village. My mother pulled my younger sisters inside the house while my father and I stood by the door, watching the planes circle overhead. The first bombs hit the outskirts of the village. You could see the ground explode in clouds of dust and smoke, followed by a noise so loud it shook our house's walls. My father grabbed my arm and pulled me inside. We all huddled in a corner of our small home, praying and listening to the bombing grow closer and closer. The sound of the explosions was something I had never heard before. It felt as if each one were tearing the air apart. We heard children crying outside, and people calling for their families, and then more bombs fell. The ground shook beneath us, glass from our windows shattered, and debris fell to the floor. That day, my family was lucky. None of us were injured, but many others were not so fortunate. When the bombing paused for a while, we cautiously ventured outside to navigate through the rubble of our village. I saw houses flattened, people digging through debris for their loved ones, and neighbors' faces covered in dust and tears. The air was thick with smoke, and a burning smell lingered in the village. Not far from our home, I saw a father carrying his child's body, a boy not much younger than me, his lifeless form hanging in his arms. I will never forget the look in that man's eyes. He was in shock, numbed by the horror around him, but there was nothing he could do. The village clinic was destroyed, and no help could be found. He simply carried his son and wandered among the ruins like many others that day.
the bombing continued for days. Each night, Kunduz sky lit up as American planes and NATO jets bombed Taliban positions and inadvertently civilians as well. Taliban fighters had blended into villages, using homes and people as shields, while it seemed that Americans were determined to eradicate them at any cost. They bombed not only Taliban hideouts but also roads, bridges, and even schools. With my own eyes, I saw the aftermath of a school that had been hit. Nothing but rubble and dust remained. No soldiers were hiding there, only remnants of books and desks where children once sat. As fighting intensified, we fled from our village. Along with hundreds of others, my family made the difficult decision to leave everything behind, our home, crops, and livestock. We packed what we could carry and joined a long line of refugees heading toward the mountains. It was a desperate time, there was no food or shelter, and winter was approaching. I remember my younger sister asking me why this was happening. If they wanted to defeat the Taliban, why were they bombing us? How could they not see civilians who were suffering? As we walked on, I saw more families struggling, more children and elderly people trying to keep up. Many were barefoot, their feet bled from rocky paths, and some were too weak to continue. We shared what little food we had among ourselves, but it was never enough. The fear of bombs followed us everywhere, even when we were far from the village, the sound of jets made us run. I never returned to my village. By the time the bombing ended, Kunduz had been largely devastated. The Taliban either fled or were killed but left behind a shattered province. Many of my friends and neighbors never returned, either killed in the bombing or lost along the way as refugees. U.S. forces moved in, followed soon by NATO troops in Kunduz. However, for us, the damage had already been done. The opening airstrikes. On October 7, 2001, just weeks after the 9/11 attacks, the United States commenced Operation Enduring Freedom with a series of coordinated airstrikes against Taliban targets. Dubbed the shock and awe strategy, these airstrikes aimed to incapacitate the Taliban's military capabilities and create a psychological impact on both the Taliban and the Afghan populace. Targeting key infrastructure, military installations, and training camps, the initial wave of airstrikes sought to cripple the Taliban's ability to respond effectively. The U.S. military utilized advanced technologies, including precision-guided munitions, to maximize destruction while minimizing collateral damage. The goal was to deliver a swift and overwhelming response that would disrupt Taliban operations and signal a new era of U.S. engagement in the region. As the air campaign unfolded, reports of destruction and casualties began to filter through, evoking mixed reactions among the Afghan populace and the international community.
While the airstrikes dominated the initial phase of the invasion, U.S. Special Forces were simultaneously deployed on the ground to assist in the fight against the Taliban. Operating alongside the Northern Alliance and other anti-Taliban factions, these elite units played a crucial role in coordinating military efforts and gathering intelligence. The integration of special forces with local resistance groups allowed for a more nuanced and effective military strategy, leveraging local knowledge to navigate the challenging terrain. Special forces conducted targeted raids and provided critical support to the Northern Alliance, enhancing their offensive capabilities. This collaboration proved vital in executing rapid maneuvers and ensuring that Taliban positions were effectively targeted. The combination of air power and ground operations created a formidable force, allowing the coalition to gain momentum quickly. As U.S. airstrikes intensified, the Northern Alliance alongside with U.S. and its alliance launched its own military offensive against Taliban positions in the north of Afghanistan. With the support of U.S. air power, the Northern Alliance was able to achieve significant territorial gains, capturing strategic cities such as Mazar-i-Sharif and pushing southward toward Kabul. Their commitment to resisting the Taliban's oppressive regime resonated with many Afghans, fostering a sense of hope amid the chaos. The Northern Alliance's offensive highlighted the complexities of Afghan tribal politics, as different factions vied for power and influence. However, the prospect of liberation from Taliban rule unified many groups against a common enemy. The offensive showcased the effectiveness of combining local resistance with international support, demonstrating a model for future military engagements in Afghanistan. By late November 2001, the Taliban began retreating from major cities in response to the relentless assault from coalition forces. The combination of airstrikes, ground operations, and the Northern Alliance's advances forced the Taliban to abandon key strongholds, resulting in the rapid collapse of their control over urban centers. Cities like Herat and Jalalabad fell to the coalition forces, marking a significant shift in the war's dynamics. The retreat of Taliban forces created a vacuum of power in many areas, raising concerns about lawlessness and the potential for rival factions to vie for control. While the U.S. military celebrated these victories, the challenges of governance and security loomed large. The swift fall of the Taliban regime raised questions about the sustainability of the coalition's success and the future of Afghanistan.
As coalition forces continued to advance, strategic cities became focal points in the campaign against the Taliban. Mazar-i-Sharif, a key city in northern Afghanistan, was captured by the Northern Alliance in early November, bolstered by U.S. air support. This victory allowed the Northern Alliance to consolidate power in the north and establish a foothold from which to launch further offensives. Kandahar, the spiritual home of the Taliban, became a critical target as coalition forces sought to dismantle the heart of the regime. The city's capture would symbolize the collapse of Taliban rule. In December 2001, U.S. forces, along with the Northern Alliance, launched an offensive against Kandahar, ultimately leading to its fall. The capture of these cities signaled a turning point in the conflict, marking the effective dismantling of the Taliban's military capabilities. On November 13, 2001, Kabul fell to the Northern Alliance and U.S. forces, marking the symbolic end of Taliban rule in the capital. The event was celebrated by many Afghans who had long endured the oppressive regime. Scenes of jubilation and relief filled the streets as citizens expressed their hope for a new beginning. However, the euphoria was tinged with uncertainty as the realities of war and the challenges of rebuilding loomed ahead. The capture of Kabul represented not just a military victory but a shift in the geopolitical landscape of Afghanistan. As the Northern Alliance took control of the city, they faced the daunting task of establishing a governance structure amidst the remnants of a devastated state. The immediate challenges of maintaining security and providing basic services would soon become apparent as rival factions sought influence in the post-Taliban environment. The fall of Kabul elicited mixed reactions from the international community. Many nations welcomed the swift military success, viewing it as a necessary response to the threat posed by the Taliban and al-Qaeda. The UN Security Council passed resolutions supporting the intervention and emphasizing the need for humanitarian assistance and reconstruction efforts in Afghanistan. However, concerns also emerged regarding the long-term implications of the military campaign. Some analysts warned that a swift military victory did not guarantee stability or peace in Afghanistan. The potential for a power vacuum and the resurgence of rival factions raised alarms about the challenges of nation-building in a country long ravaged by conflict. In the wake of Kabul's fall, Afghan citizens experienced a mix of emotions. Celebrations erupted among those who had suffered under Taliban rule, with many expressing hope for a brighter future. Women took to the streets, advocating for their rights and demanding a voice in the new political landscape. The removal of the Taliban brought a sense of liberation to those who had been oppressed for years. However, fear and uncertainty also permeated the atmosphere. Reports of looting and violence began to surface as law enforcement structures crumbled. The rapid transition from Taliban rule to a power vacuum raised concerns about security and the potential for retaliatory violence against those who had collaborated with the Taliban. The complexities of Afghan society, marked by ethnic divisions and historical rivalries, would soon challenge the fragile peace. This invasion may have toppled the Taliban regime, but for people like me, it brought nothing but destruction and loss. We lost our homes, we lost our livelihoods.
setting the scene for 2 decades of conflict. In the early hours of October 7, 2001, the skies over Afghanistan filled with the roar of American warplanes, marking the start of a military campaign that would span 2 tumultuous decades. Operation Enduring Freedom, launched by the United States and its allies in response to the 9/11 attacks, signaled not just the beginning of a war but the opening of a chapter in Afghanistan's long history of conflict, foreign intervention, and resilience. For the next 20 years, Afghanistan would serve as a focal point of global geopolitics, a crucible for military experimentation, and a graveyard for grand ambitions. The invasion marked the beginning of what would become one of the most complex and protracted conflicts of the 21st century, a war that would leave deep scars on Afghanistan and redefine the global security landscape.
A land of intricate histories. To understand the events that unfolded between 2001 and 2021, it is essential to first grasp the context of Afghanistan's complex history. Situated at the crossroads of Central Asia, Afghanistan has long been a coveted prize for empires. Its location, straddling the Persian, Indian, and Central Asian worlds, made it a crucial piece in what was known as the Great Game, the 19th-century struggle between the British Empire and Tsarist Russia for control over Central Asia. Even before that, Afghanistan had witnessed waves of invasions by Alexander the Great, the Mongols, the Mughals, and numerous other conquerors, each leaving an indelible mark on the land and its people. By the late 20th century, Afghanistan was once again drawn into global conflicts, this time as a battleground in the Cold War. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in a bid to support its communist allies in the Afghan government. What followed was a decade-long insurgency, fueled by the United States and its allies, who provided weapons and support to the Afghan Mujahideen resistance. The Soviet occupation ended in a humiliating withdrawal in 1989, but the damage was done, Afghanistan was left in ruins, and the vacuum of power set the stage for a brutal civil war, which culminated in the rise of the Taliban. The Taliban's swift conquest of Afghanistan in the 1990s brought a harsh, fundamentalist regime to power, characterized by extreme interpretations of Islamic law, the repression of women, and the suppression of ethnic and religious minorities. Yet, for many war-weary Afghans, the Taliban provided a form of stability in a country that had known little but chaos for decades. Afghanistan became a pariah state, however, largely due to its harboring of Osama bin Laden and the al-Qaeda network, which used the country as a base from which to launch terror attacks worldwide. This brings us to the morning of September 11, 2001. In a matter of hours, the world's attention turned to Afghanistan once again, as al-Qaeda claimed responsibility for the deadliest terrorist attack in American history. The U.S. response would not only topple the Taliban but also ignite a conflict that would span 2 decades, cost trillions of dollars, and claim hundreds of thousands of lives. What followed was a long, convoluted war, with shifting goals, strategies, and alliances, leading to the U.S. withdrawal in 2021 and the Taliban's sudden return to power.
The invasion, occupation, and the worldwide war on terror. The U.S. invasion of Afghanistan was initially seen as a righteous and necessary response to the 9/11 attacks. The mission was clear: to dismantle al-Qaeda, remove the Taliban from power, and prevent Afghanistan from being used as a base for terrorism ever again. But, things went wrong and the interest/priority was not to demolish the Taliban and its alliance. For the first few months, it seemed that the mission was succeeding. The Taliban were swiftly ousted from power, and al-Qaeda's networks were shattered. Kabul fell to coalition forces within weeks, and the newly installed Afghan government, led by Hamid Karzai, was internationally recognized as the legitimate authority in the country. Yet, the early military successes masked deeper problems that would soon emerge. While the Taliban had been removed from the capital and other major cities, they were not defeated. The group retreated to the rugged mountains along the Afghan-Pakistani line, where they regrouped, rearmed, and began a long and bloody insurgency. The war soon shifted from a quick military intervention to a long-term counterinsurgency campaign. Coalition forces, particularly the United States, found themselves increasingly embroiled in Afghanistan's complex tribal politics, ethnic rivalries, and deep-seated issues of governance. The mission of defeating terrorism expanded into nation-building, intending to create a stable, democratic Afghanistan that could defend itself from insurgents and no longer serve as a breeding ground for extremism. This expanded mission brought with it immense challenges. Afghanistan's weak central government struggled to assert control over the country's remote and often lawless provinces. Corruption, patronage networks, and a lack of basic infrastructure further undermined the reconstruction efforts. As the Taliban insurgency grew stronger, Afghanistan descended into a quagmire. The war, initially framed as a quick and decisive intervention, turned into a prolonged conflict with no clear end in sight. The invasion, occupation, and the worldwide war on terror. The U.S. invasion of Afghanistan was initially seen as a righteous and necessary response to the 9/11 attacks. The mission was clear: to dismantle al-Qaeda, remove the Taliban from power, and prevent Afghanistan from being used as a base for terrorism ever again. But, things went wrong, and the interest/priority was not to demolish the Taliban and its alliance. For the first few months, it seemed that the mission was succeeding. The Taliban were swiftly ousted from power, and al-Qaeda's networks were shattered. Kabul fell to coalition forces within weeks, and the newly installed Afghan government, led by Hamid Karzai, was internationally recognized as the legitimate authority in the country. Yet, the early military successes masked deeper problems that would soon emerge. While the Taliban had been removed from the capital and other major cities, they were not defeated. The group retreated to the rugged mountains along the Afghan-Pakistani line, where they regrouped, rearmed, and began a long and bloody insurgency. The war soon shifted from a quick military intervention to a long-term counterinsurgency campaign. Coalition forces, particularly the United States, found themselves increasingly embroiled in Afghanistan's complex tribal politics, ethnic rivalries, and deep-seated issues of governance. The mission of defeating terrorism expanded into nation-building, intending to create a stable, democratic Afghanistan that could defend itself from insurgents and no longer serve as a breeding ground for extremism. This expanded mission brought with it immense challenges. Afghanistan's weak central government struggled to assert control over the country's remote and often lawless provinces. Corruption, patronage networks, and a lack of basic infrastructure further undermined the reconstruction efforts. As the Taliban insurgency grew stronger, Afghanistan descended into a quagmire. The war, initially framed as a quick and decisive intervention, turned into a prolonged conflict with no clear end in sight. The Afghan War's human cost. For the people of Afghanistan, the 20-year conflict had profound and often devastating consequences. From 2001 to 2021, hundreds of thousands of Afghan civilians were killed or wounded as a result of the violence. Entire villages were razed, and millions were displaced, either as refugees fleeing to neighboring countries or as internally displaced persons within Afghanistan's borders. The war also had a significant psychological toll, with entire generations growing up in the shadow of conflict, with little hope for peace or stability. One of the most contentious issues during the war was the treatment of women and girls. Under the Taliban regime, women were barred from education and employment, forced to wear the burqa in public, and subjected to extreme punishments for even minor infractions of the Taliban's moral code. The U.S. invasion was framed by some as a liberation for Afghan women, with the promise of expanded rights and opportunities. Indeed, in the early years of the occupation, there were significant improvements in women's rights, particularly in urban areas. Women began returning to schools, entering the workforce, and even participating in politics. However, these gains were always tenuous, particularly in rural areas where the Taliban maintained influence. As the war dragged on, and particularly after the U.S. began negotiating with the Taliban for a potential peace settlement, Afghan women's rights were often seen as a bargaining chip. The U.S. withdrawal and the Taliban's return to power in August 2021 have once again put the future of Afghan women in jeopardy, with many fearing a return to the repressive policies of the past. Beyond the human cost in Afghanistan, the war also had a profound impact on the countries involved, particularly the United States. Over 2,400 U.S. soldiers lost their lives in Afghanistan, and tens of thousands more were wounded. The financial cost of the war is estimated to be over $2 trillion, a staggering sum that includes not only direct military spending but also the long-term costs of caring for veterans and the interest on the debt incurred to finance the war. Moreover, the war deeply divided the American public, particularly as it dragged on with no clear end in sight.
The geopolitical impact. The war in Afghanistan also reshaped global geopolitics. It strained U.S. relations with several key countries, particularly Pakistan, which played a complicated and often duplicitous role in the conflict. While Pakistan was officially an ally in the war on terror, its intelligence services maintained ties with the Taliban, using the group as a strategic asset to exert influence over Afghanistan. This complicated relationship undermined U.S. efforts to defeat the Taliban and created lasting mistrust between Washington and Islamabad. Meanwhile, Afghanistan became a flashpoint for regional powers, each with its own interests. Iran, with its long border with Afghanistan, sought to exert influence in the country, particularly among the Shia Hazara minority. China, concerned about instability spilling over into its rest of Xinjiang province, pursued economic investments and security cooperation in Afghanistan. Russia, still scarred by its own disastrous invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s, watched the U.S. efforts with a mixture of schadenfreude and concern, while quietly working to undermine U.S. influence in the region. As the war dragged on, the question of whether Afghanistan was worth the cost became increasingly difficult to answer. What started as a clear mission to defeat terrorism and bring stability to a troubled region became a war with no clear objectives, no clear victory, and no clear end. The U.S. withdrawal in August 2021 marked the end of one chapter in Afghanistan's history, but it also opened the door to new uncertainties. The Taliban's return to power has left Afghanistan's future once again in the balance.
The lessons of Afghanistan. As we look back on the 20 years of war in Afghanistan, the question remains, what have we learned? The conflict offers many lessons about the limits of military power, the challenges of nation-building, and the complex interplay of global geopolitics. It also serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of war and the long-lasting consequences of foreign intervention. This book aims to explore these lessons, examining the military strategies, geopolitical shifts, and human stories that define Afghanistan's 20-year struggle for its future. As we delve into the chapters ahead, we will explore the key events, decisions, and turning points that shaped the course of the war. We will examine the roles of the United States, the Taliban, regional powers, and the Afghan people themselves in this long and bloody conflict. Ultimately, this book seeks to provide a comprehensive understanding of Afghanistan's tumultuous 20 years, from invasion to withdrawal, and what the future may hold for this brave yet embattled nation. Afghanistan, often called the graveyard of empires, has long been a region of immense geopolitical importance. Its rugged terrain, diverse ethnic makeup, and strategic location have attracted the interest of empires and great powers throughout history. From the British and Russian rivalry during the 19th century Great Game to the Soviet invasion in the late 20th century, and finally, the rise of the Taliban and the events leading up to 9/11, Afghanistan's history is deeply intertwined with international conflicts and power struggles.
The Great Game and Afghanistan's strategic location. Afghanistan's geographic position, a landlocked country between Central Asia, the Indian subcontinent, and the Middle East, has made it a focal point for empire building for centuries. But the term the Great Game refers to the 19th century rivalry between the British Empire and Tsarist Russia for dominance in Central Asia, where Afghanistan was a key pawn. The Great Game began in the early 19th century when Russia expanded southward into Central Asia, alarming the British, who saw this as a potential threat to their prized colonial possession, India. India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, was of paramount importance, providing vast resources and wealth to Britain. As Russia pushed into Central Asia, Britain feared that Russian influence might extend into Afghanistan and pose a direct threat to India. In 1839, Britain launched the First Anglo-Afghan War in a bid to install a pro-British ruler in Kabul and counter Russian influence. However, the British underestimated Afghanistan's fiercely independent tribes and harsh terrain. The war ended disastrously for the British, with an entire retreating British army famously massacred in 1842. Despite this setback, Britain remained deeply involved in Afghan affairs, learning that Afghanistan could not be easily controlled. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, Afghanistan served as a buffer state between British India and the expanding Russian Empire. While both Britain and Russia desired to extend their influence over Afghanistan, neither wanted to provoke a direct conflict with the other, leading to a series of diplomatic maneuvers and proxy battles. The result was the Second Anglo-Afghan War, 1878 to 1880, which ended with Britain gaining control over Afghanistan's foreign policy, though leaving internal affairs to the Afghan ruler. The Great Game effectively solidified Afghanistan's role as a neutral buffer zone, but it also left the country underdeveloped and isolated from modernizing influences. Unlike other regions of Asia, Afghanistan did not experience the same level of infrastructure development, economic integration, or political modernization that occurred in British India or Russian Central Asia. Instead, Afghanistan's tribal society remained largely intact, with local warlords and tribal leaders maintaining significant autonomy from the central government in Kabul.
The strategic importance of Afghanistan. The strategic importance of Afghanistan continued into the 20th century, as global geopolitics shifted. The country's rugged mountains and deserts made it a natural fortress, and its position as a crossroads between Persia, modern-day Iran, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent ensured that it would continue to be of interest to great powers. Afghanistan's location has long made it a gateway between empires and cultures, while its difficult terrain has served as a natural defense against foreign invasions. However, this geographic centrality came with a price. Afghanistan's political future has often been determined not by the decisions of its own rulers, but by the ambitions and strategies of external powers. The country's sovereignty was repeatedly challenged by outside forces seeking to use it as a pawn in their global strategies. This pattern would continue throughout the 20th century, culminating in the Soviet invasion in 1979. Afghanistan's geopolitical importance became starkly evident again in the late 20th century when it became a Cold War battleground. The Soviet Union, to bolster a communist regime in Kabul, invaded Afghanistan in 1979. This triggered a decade-long conflict that would leave Afghanistan devastated, pave the way for the rise of the Mujahideen, and ultimately contribute to the Soviet Union's collapse. Afghanistan's involvement in Cold War geopolitics began in earnest in 1978, when a coup by the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, a Marxist-Leninist political group, overthrew the Afghan government and established a communist regime. This coup, known as the Sohr Revolution, deeply unsettled many Afghans, particularly conservative rural populations and Islamic scholars, who viewed the PDPA's secular, socialist reforms as an affront to Afghan traditions and Islamic values. The new government, under President Noor Mohammad Taraki and later Hafizullah Amin, initiated radical reforms, including land redistribution, women's rights, and secularization of education. However, the PDPA was deeply divided, and its policies quickly alienated the majority of the population. Popular resistance grew, particularly in rural areas, where tribal and religious leaders began organizing opposition to the communist government. As the government's control weakened, the PDPA requested assistance from the Soviet Union, which had long been a supporter of Afghan communism. Fearing that Afghanistan might fall to Islamist insurgents or descend into chaos, the Soviet Union decided to intervene militarily.
The Soviet invasion of 1979. In December 1979, Soviet forces entered Afghanistan, ostensibly to stabilize the country and support the faltering communist regime. The invasion, however, sparked a massive insurgency, as various factions of Afghan fighters, known collectively as the Mujahideen, took up arms against the Soviet occupiers. The Mujahideen, composed of various ethnic, tribal, and religious groups, were united by their opposition to both the Soviet presence and the communist government in Kabul. The Soviets, despite their superior military power, found themselves mired in a brutal guerrilla war. Afghanistan's harsh terrain, combined with the Mujahideen's intimate knowledge of the land and their use of hit-and-run tactics, made the Soviet military's conventional warfare strategies ineffective. The Soviet forces controlled major cities like Kabul, but much of the countryside remained in the hands of the insurgents.
U.S. and its allies support the Mujahideen. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan became a key front in the Cold War, with the United States viewing the conflict as an opportunity to weaken its Soviet rival. Through Operation Cyclone, the CIA began providing extensive funding, weapons, and training to the Mujahideen. Pakistan, particularly its Inter-Services Intelligence (ISA) agency, played a crucial role in this support, with the US and Saudi Arabia also contributing significantly to the funding of the insurgency. One of the most notable weapons provided to the Mujahideen was the US-made Stinger missile, a shoulder-fired anti-aircraft weapon that allowed the insurgents to shoot down Soviet helicopters and planes. This dramatically shifted the balance of power on the battlefield, as Soviet air superiority had previously been one of their key advantages. While the United States framed its support for the Mujahideen as part of a larger effort to promote freedom and democracy, the reality was more complex. The Mujahideen were not a monolithic group. Many factions were deeply conservative and opposed to Western-style democracy. Nevertheless, they were united in their desire to expel the Soviet forces from Afghanistan. When the Soviet Union realized its defeat in Afghanistan by the Mujahideen, who had the support of some Arab countries, the United States, and its allies, they decided to withdraw from Afghanistan. The question is, why did the United States and its allies choose to support the Mujahideen?
The Soviet withdrawal and aftermath. After nearly a decade of fighting, the Soviet Union, exhausted by the war and facing mounting international pressure, decided to withdraw its forces from Afghanistan. In February 1989, the last Soviet troops left the country, marking the end of one of the costliest conflicts of the Cold War. The Soviet-Afghan War had a profound impact on both Afghanistan and the Soviet Union. Afghanistan was left devastated, with millions of its people dead, wounded, or displaced, and much of its infrastructure destroyed. The war also left a deep legacy of factionalism and militarization in Afghan society, as various Mujahideen groups turned their guns on each other in the power vacuum that followed the Soviet withdrawal. For the Soviet Union, the war was a major factor in its eventual collapse. The conflict drained Soviet resources, sapped public morale, and exposed the limitations of Soviet military power. The withdrawal from Afghanistan was seen as a humiliating defeat, and it contributed to the unraveling of Soviet influence both domestically and internationally.
Emerge of the Taliban. The years following the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan were marked by chaos and civil war. Various Mujahideen factions, unable to agree on how to share power, fought bitterly for control of the country. Out of this anarchy emerged a new force, the Taliban, whose rise would reshape Afghanistan's future and ultimately draw the world's attention once again. After the fall of the Soviet-backed government in 1992, Afghanistan descended into a brutal civil war. Various Mujahideen factions, based on ethnic, tribal, and ideological lines, vied for control of the capital, Kabul, and other key regions. Warlords like Ahmad Shah Massoud, Ghabuddin Hekmatyar, Abdul Ali Mazari, Abdul Rashid Dostum, and many more controlled different parts of the country, but none could establish nationwide authority. This period of civil war devastated Afghanistan. Kabul, once the center of Afghan culture and politics, was reduced to ruins as rival factions bombarded the city in an attempt to seize control. The constant fighting caused massive displacement, poverty, and suffering among the Afghan population. The power vacuum allowed criminal networks and warlords to flourish, leading to widespread lawlessness and instability. In this context of lawlessness and despair, the Taliban emerged in the mid-1990s as a movement that apparently promised to restore order and Islamic values. The Taliban, composed largely of Pashtun students from Islamic religious schools, madrasas, in Kandahar, were initially a small group based in southern Afghanistan. Their name, Taliban, means students in Pashto, reflecting their religious education. Under the leadership of Mullah Muhammad Omar, the Taliban gained rapid support, particularly among Pashtun tribes and those weary of the constant warlord infighting. The group's strict interpretation of Islamic law, combined with promises to restore security, resonated with many Afghans who had grown tired of the chaos and violence of the civil war. In 1996, the Taliban seized control of Kabul, declaring the creation of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. The group quickly established a regime based on their fundamentalist interpretation of Sharia law. Women were banned from working or attending school and were required to wear the burqa in public. Cultural expressions like music, television, and movies were banned. The Taliban's rule was characterized by extreme repression, particularly of women and ethnic minorities. Yet, despite their harsh methods, the Taliban did succeed in bringing a degree of stability to much of the country, as they crushed rival warlords and imposed their strict version of order.
The situation in Afghanistan just before September 11. Afghanistan was in a critical condition by the time the new millennium arrived. The nation was mostly cut off from the global community, acknowledged by only a handful of countries. The Taliban maintained control over the majority of Afghanistan, carrying out human rights violations and severe repression. Resistance, led by Ahmad Shah Massoud's Northern Alliance, continued in some parts of northern regions to overthrow the Taliban. Don't forget the period when Afghanistan was completely engulfed in chaos and calamity. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, leading to a civil war and the subsequent rise of the Taliban, resulting in a fatal outcome for the Afghan people. All parties involved in Afghanistan, including Mujahideen, Hekmatyar, Massoud, Dostum, Mazari, Saif, and others, and the Taliban, are held accountable for their actions. These specific factions of Mujahideen committed atrocities and inhumane actions during the Civil War and beyond. The true Mujahideen who defeated the Soviet Union are the Afghan people who will always be remembered as heroes by the people of Afghanistan.
Humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. Afghanistan was on the verge of falling apart on the eve of 9/11. The Afghan people had suffered greatly due to years of war, instability, and repression. Millions of Afghans resided in severe poverty, lacking adequate access to healthcare, education, and essential services. The continuing civil war caused millions to flee, with many finding shelter in nearby countries such as Pakistan and Iran. The strict control of the Taliban worsened the humanitarian crisis. The international community criticized the regime's treatment of women and girls, specifically. In 2001, Afghanistan had one of the world's lowest literacy rates, and women's rights were nearly non-existent. In addition, the nation's infrastructure was destroyed, and its economy was almost non-existent, surviving mainly through illegal drug trafficking. During that period, Afghanistan and its citizens were experiencing worldwide isolation. Afghanistan was left isolated due to the Taliban's connection to Al-Qaeda and their non-compliance with global standards. The Taliban government was officially recognized only by Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. The UN and other global institutions had enforced penalties on Afghanistan to push the Taliban to cut connections with terrorist organizations and enhance their human rights performance. On September 11, 2001, the deadliest attack in history was carried out by Al-Qaeda, who hijacked 4 planes and crashed them into the World Trade Center towers in New York City, the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and a field in Pennsylvania. The world was shocked by the attacks, which resulted in the deaths of almost 3,000 individuals. Following the 9/11 attack, the U.S. is prepared to launch an attack on Afghanistan, citing connections between the country and the events of 9/11. Numerous inquiries must be addressed by the U.S. to provide solid proof of the 9/11 attack. As the writer of this book, I am declining to recognize Afghanistan's involvement in this assault because of the lack of proof and ambiguous details provided. I am just trying to say that the people of Afghanistan have endured and are still enduring because of the harsh and unfair actions of the US and its allies in the region. Following the attacks on September 11, the United States and its allies insisted that the Taliban surrender Osama bin Laden and dismantle al-Qaeda's activities in Afghanistan. The Taliban's rejection led to the beginning of the US-led invasion of Afghanistan, marking the start of 2 decades of conflict, occupation, and a new era in Afghanistan's tumultuous history. Before the invasion, occupation, Afghanistan was a country in ruin, destroyed by conflict, governed by an oppressive government, and acting as a sanctuary for global extremists. The aftermath of 9/11 would have lasting effects on Afghanistan and the world.
The decision to attack/invade Afghanistan. During the decision-making process in the U.S. government following the 9/11 attacks, Afghanistan became a main target for military intervention. The U.S. president, supported by his important advisors and officials in national security, saw the military operation as essential in breaking down al-Qaeda's network and ousting the Taliban regime. The government portrayed the invasion as essential to both seek retribution for the attacks and prevent potential future dangers. U.S. officials stated that military action targeted both the Taliban regime and al-Qaeda, signaling a new stage in the counterterrorism efforts. When the President of the United States, along with his advisors, decided to launch an attack on Afghanistan, he also sought the help of the international community to support him in these actions and join his decision, which many countries indeed did. The decision to target Afghanistan was not made in isolation, rather, it was strengthened by global sentiments against terrorism. Many countries expressed solidarity with the United States and affirmed the need to confront the threat posed by al-Qaeda. As evidence of the Taliban's complicity became public, global support for military action increased, paving the way for the formation of a coalition. International leaders supported the U.S. rationale for targeting Afghanistan, viewing it as a moral obligation to confront those who harbored terrorists. This justification resonated with countries around the world, leading to an alignment of interests that facilitated a broad coalition against the Taliban. The formation of global alliances for the invasion of Afghanistan was marked by unprecedented unity and cooperation among nations. The 9/11 attacks spurred countries worldwide to join the fight against the Taliban, resulting in a coalition that conducted military operations in Afghanistan under a unified banner. Many countries may have wanted to show solidarity, and so they joined this US-led initiative, but they perhaps failed to realize that, on the other side, they were contributing to the destruction of a nation already on the brink of ruin. During the attack on Afghanistan and throughout its 20-year presence there, the US did whatever it wanted, without ever being held accountable. The U.S., during its 20-year presence, was accused of numerous crimes, including bombing funerals, wedding ceremonies, hospitals, schools, and madrasas, killing innocent people, conducting nighttime operations, and raiding people's homes, dishonoring women, and committing other crimes and atrocities. In any case, the question here is how the U.S. managed to swiftly create a coalition to jointly attack Afghanistan. In the days following the 9/11 attacks, the United States began to assemble a coalition of countries willing to participate in military operations to invade Afghanistan. The U.S. government actively engaged in diplomatic discussions with its allies, emphasizing the urgency of the situation and the need for collective action. This coalition, formed by the U.S., was not limited to NATO members. Countries from around the world, unfortunately, announced their support. This broad participation demonstrated how a war-torn and impoverished nation could be further destroyed. With most countries joining in from across the world, a coalition emerged that included military participation, intelligence sharing, and logistical support. One significant component of the U.S. coalition for attacking Afghanistan was NATO. NATO played a critical role in forming this coalition, and by invoking Article 5, it demonstrated a collective commitment to mutual defense. The alliance's swift response to the 9/11 attacks marked a crucial moment in NATO's evolution, transforming it from a Cold War defense organization into an active force addressing modern threats. NATO members allocated troops and resources to support U.S. military efforts and eventually, in 2003, took command of the International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, in Afghanistan. This commitment underscored the importance of collective security and NATO's readiness to engage in operations beyond Europe. As I mentioned, this coalition included not only NATO member countries but also non-NATO nations. The coalition included several non-NATO countries that played important roles in the military effort. Countries such as Australia, Japan, South Korea, and several Central Asian nations provided troops, logistical support, and financial assistance. This diverse coalition seemingly indicated a broad international consensus on fighting terrorism and stabilizing Afghanistan. But in reality, it pursued different goals unrelated to Afghanistan and its people. Each of these nations added unique capabilities to the coalition, enhancing the overall effectiveness of the military campaign. For instance, Australia sent its special forces, while Central Asian countries provided crucial access for U.S. operations in Afghanistan. Why was the U.S. intent on forming a global coalition and sought to include most countries? Well, the formation of a global coalition to attack Afghanistan was not merely a military endeavor, it was also a political and moral one. Many countries apparently recognized the importance of presenting a united front against terrorism and sought to enhance their credibility and influence on the international stage by participating in this effort. The coalition's diverse composition allowed for a range of perspectives and expertise, contributing to the development of strategies and policies to address the challenges in Afghanistan. The legitimacy provided by the coalition reinforced the credibility of the U.S. military intervention, affirming the idea that fighting terrorism was a collective responsibility. The U.S.-led invasion of Afghanistan in October 2001 marked the beginning of a complex military campaign aimed at dismantling al-Qaeda and toppling the Taliban regime. However, as the initial military objectives were achieved, the focus shifted from military engagement to nation-building, a challenge fraught with difficulties, complexities, and contradictions. Nation-building is a multifaceted process that involves establishing a stable and functioning government, fostering economic development, and creating a cohesive national identity. In Afghanistan, the goals were ambitious: to replace the Taliban's authoritarian rule with a democratic government, promote human rights, particularly women's rights, and rebuild the country's war-torn infrastructure. However, the nation-building efforts in Afghanistan faced numerous obstacles, including a lack of political cohesion, pervasive corruption, tribal divisions, and a resilient insurgency. The challenge was further complicated by the historical context of Afghanistan, where decades of conflict had deeply affected its societal fabric. The international community played a significant role in the nation-building efforts in Afghanistan. The Bonn Agreement, established in December 2001, laid the groundwork for a transitional government and a new constitution. Nations from around the world contributed resources, financial aid, and troops to support the Afghan National Army, ANA, and the Afghan National Police, ANP. However, the involvement of foreign powers often created tensions between international objectives and local realities. The Afghan people were skeptical of foreign intervention, viewing it as another form of imperialism rather than genuine support for their sovereignty. This skepticism undermined efforts to build a legitimate Afghan government, as many citizens felt excluded from the decision-making processes. As the years progressed, the difficulties in establishing a stable Afghan government became increasingly evident. Corruption plagued the political landscape, with powerful warlords and politicians often prioritizing personal gain over national interests. Efforts to build democratic institutions were hampered by a lack of effective governance structures and insufficient capacity within the Afghan bureaucracy. Moreover, the Afghan economy remained heavily reliant on international aid, which created a cycle of dependency that hindered sustainable development. While some progress was made in areas like education and healthcare, the overall economic situation remained precarious, exacerbated by ongoing conflict and instability. The challenges of nation-building in Afghanistan raised questions about the effectiveness of military intervention as a means to achieve lasting peace and stability. As the US and NATO forces focused on counterinsurgency strategies, the limitations of their approach became apparent. The Taliban's resilience and ability to regroup demonstrated that military might alone could not solve the deep-rooted issues facing Afghanistan. The complexities of nation-building illustrated the need for a comprehensive strategy that integrated military, diplomatic, and developmental efforts. Unfortunately, the lack of coordination and coherence among various actors further complicated the situation, resulting in a fragmented approach that often failed to achieve its intended goals.
Civilian casualties. The human cost of the war in Afghanistan was staggering, affecting countless lives and leaving an indelible mark on the nation and its people. From civilian casualties to displacement, the toll of conflict was felt across every aspect of Afghan society. One of the most devastating aspects of the war was the high number of civilian casualties. According to the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, UNAMA, thousands of civilians were killed or injured during the conflict, with many more suffering from the long-term effects of violence. The toll included not only those directly killed in military operations but also those who died from indirect causes such as lack of access to healthcare, food insecurity, and displacement. The rise of the Taliban insurgency in the mid-2000s further exacerbated civilian suffering. Suicide bombings, improvised explosive devices, IEDs, and targeted assassinations became common tactics, leading to increased casualties among civilians. This created a climate of fear and insecurity, hindering efforts to rebuild the nation and undermining public support for both the Afghan government and international forces.
Displacement and refugees and impact on women and children. The conflict in Afghanistan led to one of the largest displacement crises in the world. Millions of Afghans were forced to flee their homes due to violence, instability, and insecurity. Internally displaced persons, IDPs, faced dire conditions in overcrowded camps with limited access to basic services such as clean water, healthcare, and education. Additionally, the protracted conflict spurred waves of refugees seeking safety in neighboring countries and beyond. Many Afghans faced difficult journeys, often encountering harsh conditions and discrimination. The humanitarian crisis created by the war had far-reaching implications, affecting not only Afghanistan but also regional stability and international relations. The human cost of conflict was particularly pronounced for women and children. During the Taliban's initial rule in the 1990s, women were subjected to severe restrictions, including bans on education and employment. Although significant progress was made in the early years of the U.S. intervention, ongoing violence and insecurity continued to pose challenges for women's rights. Women faced increased risks of violence, including domestic abuse and gender-based violence, which were often exacerbated by the conflict. Children were also deeply affected, with millions missing out on education due to insecurity and poverty. The impact of war on the younger generation would shape Afghanistan's future, as many children grew up amid violence and instability, potentially perpetuating cycles of conflict.
Long-term consequences. The human cost of conflict extended beyond immediate casualties and displacement. The psychological trauma experienced by individuals and communities created lasting scars that would take generations to heal. Issues such as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, anxiety, and depression became prevalent among both civilians and combatants. As the international community grappled with the consequences of war, the need for comprehensive support services for affected populations became evident. However, the ongoing conflict made it difficult to provide adequate resources and assistance, leaving many individuals and communities to cope with their trauma in isolation.
Geopolitical shifts during 20 years of war. The war in Afghanistan had profound implications not only for the country itself but also for the broader geopolitical landscape. As the conflict unfolded, it reshaped alliances, influenced foreign policies, and changed perceptions of security threats. This topic will be explored in greater depth in the second edition of A Nation with Two Faces.
U.S. foreign policy and global engagement. The invasion of Afghanistan marked a significant shift in U.S. foreign policy, characterized by a renewed focus on counterterrorism and the need to combat the global spread of extremism. The U.S. military engagement in Afghanistan set a precedent for future interventions, leading to increased military presence in regions deemed vulnerable to terrorism. The conflict also prompted a re-evaluation of traditional alliances and partnerships. Countries that supported the U.S. intervention sought to align their foreign policies with the global fight against terrorism, leading to new strategic partnerships and defense agreements. However, these alliances were often tested by the complexities of the conflict and differing national interests.
The rise of China and Russia. As the U.S. became embroiled in Afghanistan, other global powers, particularly China and Russia, began to reposition themselves within the international order. China's growing economic influence allowed it to play a more active role in regional affairs, particularly in Central Asia. The Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, further demonstrated China's ambition to expand its influence and secure access to resources in Afghanistan and beyond. Russia, on the other hand, sought to reassert its influence in Central Asia following the U.S. intervention. Moscow engaged with regional actors and began to cultivate relationships with the Taliban, viewing it as a necessary counterbalance to U.S. presence in the region. This shifting geopolitical landscape highlighted the complexities of international relations in the post-9/11 era. The war in Afghanistan also had significant implications for regional dynamics in South Asia. Pakistan, which had initially supported the Taliban, found itself in a complicated position as the U.S. sought its cooperation in combating terrorism. The Pakistani military and intelligence services were drawn into the conflict, navigating a delicate balance between supporting the U.S. and addressing domestic concerns regarding militancy. The rise of other terrorist groups in the region, such as ISIS-K, further complicated the security landscape. The emergence of these groups created new challenges for both Afghanistan and its neighbors, necessitating a more nuanced approach to counterterrorism efforts.
The Taliban's return and Afghanistan's uncertain future. As the years passed and the war dragged on, the Taliban's resurgence became increasingly evident. Despite efforts to establish a stable government and build a functioning state, the insurgency adapted and capitalized on the challenges faced by the Afghan government and international forces. By the mid-2010s, the Taliban had regained significant territory and influence in Afghanistan. Their ability to conduct attacks, exploit grievances, and gain local support showcased their resilience and adaptability. The Taliban's strategy of targeting Afghan security forces and government officials undermined efforts to stabilize the country, leading to a growing sense of insecurity. The insurgents also positioned themselves as a legitimate alternative to the government, promising to restore order and security in areas where the Afghan state struggled to exert control. This narrative resonated with some communities disillusioned by corruption and the ineffectiveness of government institutions.
Negotiations and the Doha Agreement. In a bid to bring an end to the conflict, the U.S. began negotiating with the Taliban, culminating in the signing of the Doha Agreement in February 2020. This agreement set the stage for the withdrawal of U.S. forces and initiated a dialogue between the Taliban and the Afghan government. While the negotiations were intended to pave the way for peace, they raised concerns about the future of Afghanistan. The exclusion of certain groups and the limited representation of women in the negotiations fueled apprehensions about the Taliban's intentions and the potential regression of hard-won rights and freedoms. As the U.S. began its withdrawal in 2021, the Taliban quickly advanced, seizing control of vast swaths of territory. The speed of their resurgence took many by surprise and raised alarms about the implications for the Afghan people and regional stability. The Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, ANDSF, struggled to withstand the Taliban's offensive, leading to a collapse of the government and the eventual fall of Kabul in August 2021. The withdrawal raised critical questions about the effectiveness of the international community's two-decade effort in Afghanistan. Many wondered whether the sacrifices made in blood and resources had achieved lasting results or if the country was doomed to repeat its tumultuous history. The Taliban's return to power in Afghanistan marked a new chapter in the country's history, characterized by uncertainty and trepidation. As the group sought to establish its rule, concerns arose about human rights, governance, and the future of Afghanistan's citizens. The international community faced a dilemma: how to engage with a Taliban-led government while advocating for the rights and welfare of the Afghan people. The road ahead for Afghanistan remained fraught with challenges. The complex interplay of internal dynamics, regional politics, and international relations would shape the country's future. The legacy of the past 2 decades, a mix of progress and setbacks, would continue to influence the trajectory of Afghanistan, highlighting the difficulties of building a stable, inclusive, and prosperous nation in the face of deep-rooted challenges.
The legacy of 20 Years' War. The 2-decade-long war has brought immense disasters upon the people of Afghanistan. The Afghan people were left behind by their international allies, who had once promised hope and support. Unfortunately, the United States and its allies showed indifference and withdrew, leaving a trail of unfulfilled promises and shattered expectations. There are countless legacies of the 20-year war, too many to list in full. However, I have highlighted some of the most significant ones below. 1. Fears of continued conflict. 2. The risk of resurgence of violence. 3. Despite hopes for peace, fears of continued violence and conflict remain pervasive. 4. Internal power struggles within the Taliban and among other factions pose a risk of renewed violence. The potential for splinter groups to emerge and challenge the Taliban's authority could lead to further instability. 5. Potential for regional conflicts. Afghanistan's geopolitical landscape is fraught with tensions, and regional rivalries could exacerbate conflicts within the country. Neighboring countries may pursue their interests at the expense of Afghanistan's stability. 6. Humanitarian catastrophe. The combination of political instability and economic collapse raises fears of a humanitarian catastrophe. 7. Escalating humanitarian needs. The ongoing humanitarian crisis, compounded by restrictions on aid and resources, threatens the lives of millions of Afghans. Urgent action is needed to prevent widespread suffering and displacement. 8. Ban girls' education/ban women's work. 9. Long-term dependency. Failure to address the root causes of the crisis could lead to long-term dependency on humanitarian aid, hindering efforts for sustainable development and recovery.
Before I move on to the conclusion, let me clearly remind you that the 20-year war was a lose-lose-lose-lose situation. Every party involved in this war came out as a loser, no one truly won. However, the people of Afghanistan were the ones who suffered the most, they were the greatest losers and bore the heaviest punishment. Conclusion. The war in Afghanistan, characterized by ambitious nation-building efforts, profound human costs, and significant geopolitical shifts, revealed the complexities and contradictions inherent in military intervention. The challenges of establishing a stable government, the toll on civilians, and the resilience of the Taliban all contributed to a tumultuous landscape. As the U.S. and its allies grappled with the realities of war and nation-building, the lessons learned from 2 decades of conflict highlighted the need for comprehensive strategies that addressed the root causes of instability. The Taliban's resurgence and the uncertain future of Afghanistan served as a reminder that the path to peace and stability is often fraught with challenges, requiring ongoing commitment, collaboration, and a deep understanding of the complexities at play. The themes of war and nation-building, the human cost of conflict, geopolitical shifts, and the Taliban's return collectively weave a rich narrative that defines Afghanistan's tumultuous journey from invasion to withdrawal. As we navigate these themes throughout the book, we aim to provide a comprehensive understanding of the multifaceted issues at play in Afghanistan, highlighting the interplay between local realities and global dynamics. Ultimately, these themes serve not only to illuminate the historical trajectory of Afghanistan but also to engage readers in a critical reflection on the lessons learned and the implications for future interventions in conflict-affected regions. By grounding our exploration in these themes, we hope to foster a deeper understanding of the challenges and complexities that lie at the heart of Afghanistan's struggle for peace and stability. In the first edition of A Nation with Two Faces, A Brave Nation in the Darkness, some topics were explained briefly, while many others were left out. These will be addressed in greater detail in the second edition, along with topics that were not sufficiently covered the first time. As the author of this book, I have made every effort to remain neutral and not take the side of any political party or group. If any part of this book has touched on sensitive issues or caused discomfort, I sincerely apologize. My sole intention in writing this book was to share the truth and reflect the reality of the Afghan people's experiences with the world. Thank you for listening to the audiobook A Nation with Two Faces, subtitled Brave Nation, but in the Darkness. April 2025. Dr. Azami.